Signing Stiff Little Fingers was a major coup for Rough Trade. Most successful punk bands, despite their anti-establishment roots, were signed to major record companies.
The Sex Pistols signed to EMI, famously, ended up on Virgin. The Clash signed to CBS. So they were the two leaders, really.
If we signed for CBS tomorrow, all the kids on the street would say, what a sellout. And the chances are very good. Our share of record sales would be at most a half of what we're making at the moment.
In February 1979, Rough Trade and Stiff Little Fingers' first album was released. It went to number 14 in the charts, becoming the first independent album in British music history to sell over 100,000 copies.
The day we made that record available, I looked out the window on Kensington Park Road and there were 20 taxis, 10 messenger bikes, they were all there waiting for it. And as soon as it was released, off it went into the world. It was like, whoa, people do give a damn about this stuff. It's amazing.
We were just in total chaos. I remember there was just records flying in the front door and flying out at the same time.
Stiff Little Fingers album, Rough One, was our very first album. And miraculously, it was hugely successful. It sold 100,000 copies in virtually no time at all. And it put the label on the map. And it made us say to ourselves, you know what? This isn't that hard, is it?
The Stiff Little Fingers album was a payoff for an idealism. Clash didn't really need to go to CBS. Stiff Little Fingers proved that.
I mean, 100,000 copies, that generates a huge amount of turnover. And that in itself was the building bricks on which the label was able to go forward. That was the cash flow that enabled us to do other records.
Hello, Mike, how are you?
Stiff Little Fingers' breakthrough was a key moment for the independent sector. It showed Rough Trade that one band's success could fund a whole bunch of less commercial records, as bands like the Raincoats happily discovered.
When the phone from Rough Trade saying the record is here, and I just walked down and I just felt, oh, I was on top of the world, completely.
The Raincoats were not alone, as the label began to build a roster of artists that fulfilled the Rough Trade ethos of offering a diverse alternative to mainstream music.
Metal Urbane, Dr. Mix, who were kind of, Metal Urbane's alter ego.
Essential Logic, Young Marble Giants, Scritti Politti,
The Fall,
Television personalities,
Ivor Cutler,
Swell Maps,
pop group,
and then of course there were Kleenex,
Delta 5,
Slits,
The Electric Eels, fantastic single,
Space Energy,
Robert Wyatt,
James Blood Elmer, who later worked with, or had worked with Ornette Coleman.
Subway Sector Course seems like such an important record. It's only one single. And there was all this sort of electronic stuff. Or they were doing the production and distribution for independent record labels like Throbbing Gristle, Industrial Records, which at the time was selling absolutely potloads of stuff.
The variety that you find on major labels is just, like, do you like this kind of music or do you like that kind of music? What kind of party are you having? Just get you one of these, everything's gonna happen just like that. In the Rough Trade, you met a variety and a range of people who didn't have a look in the mainstream industry and who wouldn't have a snowball's chance in hell if that's all there was to it.
By 1979, while Rough Trade was beginning to find its feet as a label, Rough Trade Distribution was becoming a serious player in the music business, driving sales for a nationwide network of increasingly successful independent labels, companies like Two Tone, who'd signed The Specials.
Here came somebody with something who used Rough Trade distribution, and they came down and they had that Al Capone single.
I remember going down with the band to Ireland, who were pressing it, coming back to the Rough Trade office with all the boxes. And then we all sat round, you know, with a rubber stamp, pressing these records just to go downstairs and get distributed.
Rough Trade realized that it could marshal its forces around something and actually make it happen. And we sold 375,000 of those singles. That was the shift, in my mind, to an understanding that it could service on the entry end where people came in and had with ideas, and it could also service on the outgoing idea. If people like that, no problem, we got it for you.
When Rough Trade began in 1976, there were about a dozen independent labels in Britain. By the end of the decade, there were over 800. Rough Trade Distribution was at the hub of this explosion of independent music, and the label had redefined the politics of record production. The music industry would never be the same again.
Stiff Little Fingers are about to embark on a fairly grueling tour of the UK, but they are with us here tonight just before they do that with their single At the End.
In 1980, Rough Trade's socialist radicals moved into new offices around the corner from the shop. They were just one of a growing movement of left-wing collectives like City Limits magazine and activist groups like Rock Against Racism that challenged the ideology of Margaret Thatcher's recently elected Conservative government.
It was an era when kind of moral values, respect for your fellow man, egalitarian sense of just brotherhood really and sisterhood came to the surface in a corrupt dog-eat-dog world, you know.
Rough Trade represented a serious alternative to the cutthroat corporate music industry. The shop had become a mecca for independent music. Richard Scott's distribution operation was expanding by the day. Jeff Travis had released over 30 singles on the Rough Trade label, and its debut album had smashed the chart monopoly of the major labels. Rough Trade's biggest problem was holding on to bands once they'd broken through. And by the time Stiff Little Fingers made it to Top of the Pops in 1980, they were no longer a Rough Trade band.
The ironic thing about Stiff Little Fingers was they couldn't wait to sign to a major straight after they'd made their Rough Trade record.
And then it dawned on us, we had a brain drain problem. So there was always this anxiety about losing talent.
If we don't respond in some sense to the growth of our band by a certain amount of growth, all it means is that we will be a nursery ground for every major label that exists in this country. And it doesn't seem in the long run as though that's a very good idea, because all it means is that you give the band a chance to live out their ideals for a few years, and then they go and join, a corporation, and whatever happens up to them after that, will happen. And it's very debatable whether that's good or bad. We think it's bad.
Rough Trade's principled refusal to tie artists to conventional record deals made the threat of losing its biggest bands ever present. Reconciling its alternative business ethic with the need to make a profit would prove a major issue throughout the 80s. It was a decade that would also raise some difficult questions about what kind of music Rough Trade should or shouldn't be releasing. A debate brought sharply into focus in 1981 when one of the label's most radical artists announced a drastic change in direction.
Well, really what happened was I started to have panic attacks, so I didn't realise that's what they were at the time. I ended up in hospital in Brighton. I hadn't spoken to my parents for very many years, so they got in touch and took me back to Wales, where I was born, and tried to help me get myself back together. And whilst I was there, I took the opportunity to take stock, really, of what we were up to. And I listened to lots of records that I hadn't really listened to before, black American pop music. So there was a discovery of black pop music and reading of lots of European thinkers, all of which ended up with me deciding that we should try and make pop music.
Making pop music meant swapping the low-tech, homemade aesthetic that Scritti Politti had already pioneered on 2 Rough Trade EPs for expensive studio production and a slick sound.
Technically, it was a new frontier. I didn't know how to write a pop song, and I wanted to find out how you did it.
The resulting record was Scritti Politti's bid for chart success, but not everybody approved.
It was a significant moment. Significant in as much as I think there were, there are lots of people at Rough Trade that kind of, didn't like it.
At the time, there was this question about, whether you like very commercial music or not. And there was also a whole ideology going on within local culture, as it were, of independence versus mainstream, of non-commercial versus commercial. And I just thought this was shadowboxing. I didn't see it as making much difference to, the balance of power in the world between rich and poor, what kind of records you made. I just couldn't see the connection.
But producing expensive, radio-friendly pop music seemed at odds with Rough Trade's alternative agenda. To some, this was tantamount to chasing hits and selling out.
The Sweetest Girl cost £60,000. Now here's a record company, Rough Trade, who's like very careful with its budgeting. I don't know what it is. It's like, we're gonna take over, really are gonna take over the world. God damn. I don't know if it's drinking too much of your own piss, starting to believe your own publicity, or what. I don't know.
That was the first evidence of a sort of cancer. Evidence of people swimming uphill to try and compete in the music industry where we were actually doing all right by being outside of it.
It was this kind of moment of like, oh, we need to plug records, we need to kind of sell lots of records, we need to kind of make really polished music, we need to have hits.
Well, this is a very interesting charge. I mean, I just don't think that I've ever gone looking for a hit in anything that I've ever thought about. I think there's a very different thing when somebody makes a hit and gives you a hit. And I think Scritti Politti's Sweetest Girl is, without a shadow of a doubt, worthy of being a hit.
The Sweetest Girl's highest chart position was 64 in 1981. It wasn't a hit. Undeterred, Rough Trade went on to sign another, more commercially focused band.
Contemporaries of Orange Juice, some 3 years ago on the Postcard label, and now tasting the heady wine of success on the Rough Trade label with their first LP. So could you please welcome to the studio, Aztec Camera.
There began to be these discussions going around the office that I'd hear about how we can disguise the socialist political agenda and make it pop, and so we'll get kids singing along to pop records with this agenda that they were going to be able to push across to Top of the Pops or something. And there began to be all this weird talk about whether it would sell or not, which had never been their modus.
I think that people forget that Stiff Little Fingers was a big commercial success, that we were distributing records that were hits. It was never part of the Rough Trade project to shy away from the mainstream if the mainstream came to Rough Trade, but we never went running after it.
Three lads from Glasgow woke up this morning to find that their single had leapt into the top 20. Can you believe it? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Aztec Camera.
When Aztec Camera did make it into the charts in 1983, just like Stiff Little Fingers before them, they'd left Rough Trade. And a year later, when Scritti Politti finally made the top 10, they too had signed to a major. It seemed that the label couldn't deliver a hit, even if it had wanted one.
We were still very young as a record company. We still had a huge amount to learn about the apparatus of selling records, of sales forces, of sales teams, of making deals with supermarkets, of making sure that we were as competitive as the next person.
But just as Scritti Politti left Rough Trade, their guest keyboard player did unexpectedly crack the top 40.
One of the few songs inspired by the recent Falklands War was called Shipbuilding. It was written by Elvis Costello and Clive Manger and performed by Robert Wyatt. Now, it won various critics' polls as the best single of last year, and now it's being re-promoted by Rough Trade in an effort to give it the success it deserves.
Jeff Travis signed Robert Wyatt in an attempt to rescue an important artist from musical obscurity. Hit records were not on the agenda.
We were trying to earn a living. I hadn't been in the wheelchair that long. I've been in a wheelchair since sort of, what was it, hospital 73, came out, put a record out 74. And I just got in a panic after a while. The record company I was officially with, although I didn't want to be with, didn't allow me to make any LPs for anybody else, even though I couldn't make any for them either. And Jeff said, well, let's make some singles then. The great thing about making singles for Jeff was the commercial potential was ignored, just as well.
Robert Wyatt took Shipbuilding, an anti-war protest song, to number 36 in 1982. It displayed Rough Trade's political credentials and chimed with the label's support for other left-wing campaigns.
It's almost as if the great unconscious of pop musicians has slightly been pricked by a few things in the past few months. I think it's wonderful.
The charge that Rough Trade was only interested in chasing hits was also at odds with a roster that included Mark E. Smith's uncompromising band of maverick Mancunians, The Fall.
Something to dance to, a certain kettle style.
I wasn't expecting Mark to have a hit. I was just expecting him to continue to make great records.
Lousy celebrity makes record.
Records by The Fall, Père Ubu, Cabaret Voltaire and the Swell Maps proved Rough Trade's commitment to challenging and alternative music.